So, when was the last time that you had a mountaintop experience? Has it been a while? I grew up in the church, and so one of the things that we did when I was in the youth group was that every year, every summer, we went to a place called Fort Caswell. Now, right behind the Holy Land, Fort Caswell is the place to go if you want to find God. And every summer, we went there. Now, people went there for different reasons, maybe just to, get away from home or get out of their little small town, or maybe to meet a boyfriend or girlfriend. But I went there to find God. And every summer that I went there, God was there. It was amazing. It was a mountaintop experience. And we went back every summer and couldn't wait to go, because every summer God showed up. Every summer it was meaningful. It was powerful. And I have no doubt that those experiences shaped my life and made me into the person I am today in some ways. We had another mountaintop experience more recently when my wife and I celebrated our 10-year anniversary. We saved up and decided to take a trip over to the Eternal City. So we traveled over to Rome for a little bit less than a week, and we went down south to Naples, and we went up north to Florence. But one of the highlights of our time was a tour through the Vatican. And I will never forget looking up at the paintings in the Sistine Chapel. And that was a mountaintop experience, when you realize how many years had been spent painting those images of Christ's return. When is the last time that you had a mountaintop experience? I think whether we think of ourselves as religious people or not, whether we think of ourselves as spiritual or not, we all have a desire for some type of mountaintop experience or some type of encounter with the divine, whether we call it that or not. When was the last time that you had a mountaintop experience with God? When we consider Peter's life, what we see is that Peter's life with Jesus was filled with mountaintop kinds of experiences. When Jesus called Peter to be one of the disciples, Peter was just a successful fisherman living in Capernaum. We don't know a whole lot about his life before he met Jesus. His name was actually Simon before he was called by Jesus to become a disciple. We do know that Peter was married at some point. We're not sure if his wife was alive or not by the time Jesus comes onto the scene in his life. It's possible that he had children. We don't know. There are a lot of details that are just not clear or left out. But what we do know about Peter is that he had a really big personality. He was confident. He was boisterous. He was brave. He was bold, dedicated, impulsive. He had an all-in kind of personality. Peter didn't do anything halfway or half-heartedly. He was fearless. He was adventurous. And we know for certain that he was always outspoken. Now, I'll let you decide if Peter would have been the church-going kind of folk we might want to sit beside in church today. He may or may not have qualified to be a deacon. Who knows? But he was certainly the kind of guy who loved to experience life, and that he did. Peter's first encounter with Jesus happened one morning after he had been doing his favorite thing, fishing. Luke's gospel describes Jesus' call to Peter in this way. In chapter 5, verses 6 through 8, "And Simon answered, 'Master, we toiled all night, and we caught nothing. But at your word I will take down the nets.' And when they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled the boats, so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, 'Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord.'" When Peter first encountered Jesus, he was fishing. He had fished all night, and they hadn't caught anything. And Jesus shows up on the scene. He says, why don't you throw your nets down over on the other side of the boat? Now, I'll let you decide if that was a miracle. I'll let you decide if Jesus saw a school of fish over here. Whatever works for you is fine with me. But what we do know is that something happened in that encounter with Jesus that made an impression on Peter. Peter realized that there was something different about Jesus. Maybe he even realized that there was something holy or divine about Jesus, because he didn't feel worthy enough to be one of his disciples. There was something in that exchange and in that encounter that amazed Peter and attracted him to Jesus. And so he followed. We don't know for sure why Peter left his fishing business behind and followed Jesus. To be honest with you, I think Peter was the kind of person who was always looking for the next adventure. He had been fishing his whole life and done very well. But this was a new opportunity. This would be a new adventure. Peter's first mountaintop experience, if you will, with Jesus came on a stormy and windy night when all of the disciples were in a boat together. It was late one night, and Peter and the other disciples found themselves in a serious situation, fighting a strong headwind and hammering waves. Between the fear of losing their lives at sea and the arduous, painful task of rowing to safety, they were suddenly shocked. This bunch of fishermen and other disciples experienced something that night they had never experienced before. Abruptly and with no warning, they saw the figure of a man walking on the water near them. In surprise and fear, they cried out, "It's a ghost!" But the ghost was none other than their master, Jesus. When they realized this, Peter was the first person to speak up. And he said, "Lord, if it really is you, then command me to come to you on the water." You see, that was Peter. "Lord, if it really is you, then command me to walk out on the water to meet you." And Jesus commanded him to do just that. And Peter did something that probably none of the rest of us would have even considered. He crawls over to the edge of the boat, and he begins to step out. And I can only imagine the other disciples are going, "Peter, Peter, what are you doing? Think about this." They'd kind of been there before with him. But Peter steps out of the boat, and he steps onto the water, and he's standing. And he takes a step, and he takes another step, and maybe he takes a few more steps. And either one of two things happened at that point. Either Peter looked around and saw the waves and heard the thunder and lightning, and maybe he looked down and became afraid and fell into the water. Or maybe Peter turned around to the boat and said, "Ha, told y'all I could do this. Look at me." I think that's probably what he did. But either way, Peter ends up in the water, and Jesus ends up pulling him out. Now, that was a bit of a mountaintop experience. I imagine he bragged about that and talked about that for some time, because that was the kind of person that Peter was. The next mountaintop experience that Peter had with Jesus literally took place on top of a mountain. The Gospel of Matthew describes it this way in chapter 17. Jesus took Peter and the brothers James and John and led them up on a high mountain. Jesus' appearance changed from the inside out right before their eyes. Sunlight poured from his face. His clothes were filled with light. Then they realized that Moses and Elijah were also there in deep conversation with him. This is a scene that is indescribable. The disciples, Peter and the two brothers, they're not sure what's happening. And the text goes on to say that when the disciples saw what was happening and when they heard it, they fell flat on their faces and they were scared to death. But Jesus came over and touched them and said, "Don't be afraid." When they opened their eyes and looked around, all they saw was Jesus. Only Jesus. This was clearly an experience like no other. Once again, Peter had a mountaintop experience with God, and he loved it. He loved it. He loved the adventure. He loved the excitement of following Jesus. He loved how no matter what he said, Jesus would always come back at him with an answer or a question. He loved it. The next bit of excitement that Peter would have was on the night that Jesus was arrested. And I think in many ways this was a mountaintop experience for Peter. Most of you here know the story. Judas had agreed to betray Jesus. And he had agreed with the high priests and the Roman guards that he would lead them to the place where Jesus was. And so that night, after Jesus had broken bread with the disciples and shared a meal with the disciples, from a distance, Jesus realizes that Judas and the others are making their way toward him. And so he warns the disciples. He tells the disciples that the time is about to come. Judas shows up onto the scene with some others standing in the background. And he hugs Jesus. He kisses Jesus. The same way they would normally greet when they met one another. But this time it was different. Judas wasn't there to greet Jesus in the traditional manner. That was a sign. That was a sign to the guards that this person is Jesus. The guards began to move in. The high priests began to point their fingers at Jesus. Things become tense. The disciples come to their feet. Peter, who has sworn his allegiance to Jesus, jumps in between Jesus and the servant of the high priest. People become angry. Things get really tense. Maybe one of the Roman soldiers draws his sword, because at some point we know that Peter draws his sword. And he swings for the head of the servant of the high priest, but he ducks, so he misses. And instead he cuts off his ear. And at this Jesus says, "No more. No more." All the disciples run away, including Peter, who probably goes not quite as far as the others, just to keep an eye and watch what happens. After that, Peter followed Jesus to the place where he was taken imprisoned and where he was being questioned. And that night, Peter was confronted by several people in the crowd who came to him and said, "Hey, aren't you one of Jesus' disciples?" Peter said, "No, I'm not one of his disciples." "Hey, aren't you one of Jesus' disciples?" "Not me. I don't know who he is. I'm not one of his disciples." And we know that 3 times Peter denies Jesus. And then Jesus was crucified. Peter's next experience with Jesus would be a little bit different. Some time had passed, probably about a week, maybe a little more. A lot had taken place. Jesus had been crucified. They thought maybe that he was resurrected. There were reports of him being seen, but Peter didn't know for sure. Peter had left Jerusalem. Maybe he'd given up. Maybe he just went home to check on things, but he had gone back to fishing. He had gone back to his normal life, I believe. And so one day Peter decides to go fishing, and he invites some of the other disciples to go with him, and so they do. And so once again, they fish all night, and they don't catch anything. And just as morning begins to break again, they hear a voice from the shore that says, "Did you catch anything?" "No, we didn't catch a thing." "Why don't you throw your net over on the other side? Maybe you'll catch something then." And all of us are going, "It's obviously Jesus. Clearly that's Jesus." So they throw their nets over to the other side, and as we heard the story, once again, their nets are filled. An abundance of fish are provided there in the presence of Christ. And Peter doesn't catch on initially. He's probably just excited that they've caught all these fish, 153 to be specific. But John, the beloved disciple, who maybe was a little more intuitive than Peter, knows exactly what's happening. He knows exactly who it is. And so while Peter's running around the boat, excited, jumps down in the water, he's helping with the net and working, John grabs Peter at some point, and maybe he leans over and he says, Peter, you know that's Jesus, right? And then he realizes it. And then he climbs out of the water. He jumps in the boat. He grabs his clothes and he swims to the shore so that he would be the first person there to see Jesus. He just leaves the boat behind. He just abandons the other disciples who were there trying to bring in all these fish. But finally, they all make it back to the shore. And Peter is there and Jesus is there, and they gather around, and Jesus has breakfast prepared by a charcoal fire. And they gather around and they begin to listen to Jesus as he talks, and they begin to have conversations with each other, and they spend time together there over breakfast. But this time the conversation goes in a little bit of a different direction. Because somewhere in the story, Jesus decides to single out Peter. And he says to him, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, yes, Lord. I grabbed my clothes and jumped out of the boat. I was the first one here. You know I love you. Conversation continues. Jesus turns to Peter again and he says, Peter, do you love me? Peter looks at him again intently and he says, yes, Jesus, you know I love you. They continue to have breakfast and talk a little more. And then a third time, Jesus looks at Peter and he says, Peter, do you love me? And I think at this point in time, Peter found himself in a little bit of a predicament. I think at this point in time, Peter realized that Jesus knew that he had denied him 3 times. In fact, that's exactly what Jesus was doing. Jesus was bringing back Peter to a very low place in his life. Remember, Peter's life had been filled with these mountaintop experiences, these great adventures with Jesus. But in this moment, which would be Peter's last experience with Jesus, it's almost as if Jesus is saying, Peter, things are going to need to be a little bit different going forward. And maybe Peter was thinking, maybe there aren't going to be as many of those mountaintop experiences going forward. You see, what I think what happened in this conversation is that Peter was reminded of this low point in his life where he betrayed Jesus. Now, the good news is that Jesus forgives him. Jesus makes sure that Peter knows he's valued and loved and trusted as a disciple. Jesus is asking Peter 3 times, takes him back to a difficult time in his life. But it also takes us back to times in our lives when maybe we've failed to live up to our calling as Jesus' disciple. Jesus, for Peter, following Jesus, meant being on this great adventure where we have these great mountaintop experiences to look forward to. And oh, how even today, we look forward to those mountaintop experiences with Jesus. But I think what Jesus wanted Peter to see in this moment was that even in this low point in his life, even though Peter had in a sense failed as a disciple, he was still very much loved by Jesus. And even in that lowest point in his life, Jesus was right there with him. Oftentimes we look for God on top of a mountain, when God is down in the valley looking for us. As we close this morning, I invite you to consider what this story might mean for us as a people of faith. This morning, I invite you to reflect on this story and to think about what it means for you in your walk with Jesus. So often we feel like we have to encounter God way up high on a mountain. And in those times when we're brought low, or in those low points in our lives, in those times in our lives when maybe we just aren't as faithful as we could be, could it be that Jesus is just as present, if not maybe even more present, to us in those times as well? Would you pray with me? Gracious and loving God, we are grateful for Peter, whose wild and adventurous and outspoken faith we have so much to learn from. God, so often we make the Christian life about going from one mountaintop experience to the next, and we fail to remember that you are just as with us and just as present in the low points in our lives too. So, Father, as we spend these last few moments together in worship, reflecting on this story, may we think about what it means for us as a people of faith and what it means for each one of us and our walk with you. It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. Oftentimes, we do go looking for God up on top of a mountain. But just as Jesus met Peter in the valley, Jesus meets us in the low point of our lives too. When we fail, when we doubt, when we're afraid, Jesus is right there with us. During our time of response, we invite you to reflect on this story. And maybe you're here today and you find yourself in the valley. And if that's so, during this time, maybe you'd like to come up front and pray, or have me to pray with you. If that's the case, we invite you to do that as we spend this time reflecting.